Imagine a room, the candles flickering, guttering in the draft, and the wax is pooling on this rough wooden table, maybe looking a bit like blood.
Yeah, and the air. It's thick, isn't it? Not just with herbs, which you might expect, but something, well, fouler.
Exactly, like rot. Old bandages, that sort of metallic smell of wounds that aren't healing right. It's just heavy, a constant reminder of how fragile people were.
And right there, hovering over the scene, you've got the surgeon's hands, not gloved, obviously, cracked, stained, probably calloused from just, well, living and working.
Right, and they're getting ready, maybe wiping a lancet, a rusted one, on a cloth, a tool that could maybe save you, but just as easily, it's not.
And the patient, maybe it's a child, maybe it's a soldier,
Yeah.
just shivering on a cot. And they have no idea, really, if this cure is going to kill them faster than the disease. That's the baseline we're starting from.
So today, that's where we're going. We're doing a deep dive into this truly terrifying world of medieval medicine. You've shared some incredibly vivid sources with us, really stark stuff. And our mission, really, is to try and unpack what it was actually like for everyone involved, the patient, the practitioner. In this world where, life and death felt like a coin toss, the odds just seemed stacked against you.
Oh, completely. It was absolutely a gamble. Healing was, well, it was partly practical, partly prayer, a lot of prayer sometimes. And that line between what helps and what harms, it was incredibly blurry, sometimes non-existent.
Yeah.
So we'll get into the tools they used, the beliefs that drove them, like the humors and just the sheer desperation, really. The whole system was just overshadowed by death and, frankly, a massive misunderstanding of how the body even worked. So... yeah, brace yourselves. It's not exactly cheerful.
Right. Definitely not. Okay, let's start there with the sick room itself, because the first thing that jumps out from the sources, and it's almost impossible for us to really grasp today, is the pain. The absolute overwhelming lack of effective anesthesia. We're not talking, a quick sting. We're talking brutal procedures, invasive stuff with nothing.
Right.
Nothing real to dull the agony.
It's visceral, isn't it? The sources almost let you hear it. There's that line. A scream echoes through the infirmary, swallowed quickly by the stone walls. It paints such a picture.
Yeah, it does.
This wasn't some quiet, sterile room. It was probably quite public, quite raw. And the psychological side, knowing what was coming, that must have been torture in itself.
Just the anticipation.
Exactly. That cold certainty, as one source puts it, that survival is not promised. Imagine being that night, legs shattered, gripping the bed frame till his knuckles are white. Not just fearing death, but fearing the saw, fearing the searing iron. The treatment itself was terrifying.
And they had nothing. I mean, maybe wine.
Yeah.
But the sources say, not enough, just a strap of leather between his teeth.
That image is so stark.
It really is. Like, that's the best they could do, to stop you biting your tongue off, or maybe just something to clamp down on when they started sawing.
Yeah. The sources mention that directly. Sawing through bone while the patient bit down on leather, that tells you everything about the level of agony we're talking about.
What kind of procedures are we even talking about here? Amputations obviously seem like the big one.
Amputations were common, yes, for bad injuries or, gangrene setting complex fractures, too, often without really knowing how to align them properly. Cauterization.
Burning the wounds.
Burning wounds to stop bleeding or cleanse them with a red-hot poker, basically. Pure torture. But even things we might think of as simpler, like bloodletting.
Which is super common.
Incredibly common for almost anything. Even that was described as quick, brutal work, no anesthetic. Pain wasn't something to be managed. It was just part of it, an expected part of trying to fix things.
So this constant, intense pain, it's just the backdrop, the soundtrack to medieval healthcare.
It really was. It shaped the entire experience. It set the stage for who these practitioners were and the kinds of tools and techniques they felt were justified, which I think brings us neatly to the people actually doing the cutting.
Okay, yeah. Who were these people? Because when you hear surgeon, you think one thing, but medieval times, it was different. Often, it was the barber surgeon.
Right. And the emphasis there might be more on barbers sometimes. These weren't necessarily university-educated physicians. They were often skilled with razors, obviously, from shaving and cutting hair.
Good with their hands, I guess.
Good with their hands, steady maybe, but their medical knowledge, pretty basic, learned through apprenticeship, mostly. And the image the sources give, their aprons stiff with old blood.
Ugh. That says it all, doesn't it?
Oh.
A walking record of past procedures.
It does. It speaks to the frequency, the brutality, and the lack of concern for what we'd call hygiene. Their methods were direct, physical, often violent because, Well, what else did they have?
You mentioned sawing bone. That's blunt force.
Absolutely. And that detail about the razor, so steady when trimming beards, shook as it scraped infection from wounds, that's telling. It suggests even they knew this was different, riskier, maybe even beyond their comfort zone sometimes.
And the hygiene, or lack of it. You said they might wash their hands in wine?
Yeah, wine or vinegar sometimes. It was the closest thing they had to antiseptic, though they wouldn't have understood it that way. More like a cleaning off the visible grime, the source mentioning the water runs pink when they wash.
Because it's still bloody.
Exactly. There was just no concept of germs, of microscopic contamination. They couldn't see the real enemy, the infection they were often spreading themselves. It wasn't malice, it was profound ignorance.
It's wild to think the same person shaving your beard might be taking your leg off later that day.
A utilitarian world, wasn't it? You used the skills you had. But okay, so the barber surgeons handled the messy external stuff. What about the more internal medicine, the physicians?
Right, the physicians. They were operating on a completely different level. Less hands-on, more theoretical. And their whole world revolved around the theory of the four humors.
Ah, yes, the humors. Rooted in ancient Greek medicine, Hippocrates, Galen. This dominated medical thinking for, what, centuries?
Absolutely. The core idea was that your body contained four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And health was all about keeping these in perfect balance.
So if you were sick, the assumption was?
One of them was out of whack. Too much, too little. And the physician's job was to figure out which one and, well, rebalance it.
Which usually meant getting rid of the excess, right? Hence things like bloodletting.
Exactly. Bloodletting was huge. Cupping, too. And purging, making people vomit or have diarrhea with emetics and laxatives. All designed to expel the bad or excessive humor.
Which, ironically, probably weakened patients who were already sick and frail.
You'd think so. The sources describe it so vividly. The patient's veins stand out like blue rivers beneath parchment skin, ready for the cut. That quick, brutal work of filling a bowl with dark and glistening blood.
And always that risk. Too much and he will not wake. They must have known they were walking a fine line, even if they believed in the theory.
They seem to believe that pain itself was just a sign of this imbalance. So logically, correcting the imbalance would fix the pain. It's a whole different way of thinking about illness.
And how did they diagnose this imbalance? No blood tests, obviously.
The urine flask.
Yeah.
That was the key diagnostic tool. They'd hold it up to the light, examine the color, the clarity, sediments, sometimes even the smell, or, incredibly, the taste.
Uroscopy. They treated it like reading tea leaves almost, inspected like sacred texts, as one source says, believing they could pinpoint the exact problem just by looking at pee.
Yeah, tasting for sweetness to diagnose pissing evil, we know is diabetes.
I'm true.
Well, it shows a system based on observation, but interpreted through this very specific, very flawed humoral lens. It wasn't scientific method, it was applying ancient philosophy.
It really was. And you have to wonder, given how often these treatments must have failed or even harmed people, why did they stick with it for so long?
I think it's partly that weight of authority. Galen said it, so it must be true. And partly, what else was there? In the absence of better explanations, you cling to the system you have. Plus, sometimes people did get better, coincidentally.
True, confirmation bias is powerful. So, okay, the physicians are theorizing about humors, the barber surgeons are cutting who's actually mixing up the medicines. That brings us to the apothecaries and herbalists.
Right, and this is where things get really interesting, because they were walking this incredibly fine line. They were the pharmacists, basically, working mostly with plants.
So their gardens would have healing herbs, things we still recognize, like comfrey for bones?
Exactly. But right next to it, maybe deadly nightshade or hemlock. They were literally cultivating remedies and poisons side by side, walking that razor's edge, as the sources put it.
It highlights the inherent risk in herbal medicine without precise knowledge of dosage or active compounds.
Totally. And you see this mix of accidental success and pure guesswork, like the woman using a poultice of moldy bread on her child's infected arm.
Ah, the accidental penicillin.
Right. She has no idea why it sometimes helps. It's that it seems to. It's observation and desperation, not science.
And that uncertainty, that desperation, it really opened the door for, well, less scrupulous practices.
Yeah.
Quackery.
Oh, big time. Especially if you had money. The sources are full of it. Apothecaries selling powdered unicorn horn.
Which was really goat bone, wasn't it?
Always goat bone, apparently. But sold for royal prices.
Yeah.
Or physicians prescribing things like powdered emerald for a sick child. Imagine that. A fortune spent for dust that will do nothing.
It shows the lengths people would go to, the belief in exotic, expensive cures. And maybe the willingness of some practitioners to exploit that hope.
Yeah, you see this blend, maybe soothing honey salves, which actually have some mild antiseptic qualities, mixed with blistering plasters meant to physically draw out the illness or evil humors. It's such a mix of the potentially useful and the purely superstitious.
The apothecary shop must have been a fascinating, if slightly terrifying place. Part pharmacy, part magic shop.
Kind of. And it underscores that huge gap between rich and poor. The rich could afford useless emerald dust. The poor maybe got a folk remedy from the village. But beyond these sort of professional figures, there were others deeply involved in care, weren't there? Particularly religious figures and traditional healers.
Absolutely. Monks, nuns, midwives. They were often the primary caregivers, especially for the poor or in rural areas, and their approach was often this fascinating blend of the spiritual and the practical.
How so? I mean, monasteries often ran infirmaries, right?
They did. Monasteries were centers of learning, including preserving some medical texts, but their care was also deeply rooted in Christian charity and faith. So you'd have monks and nuns tending the sick, offering prayers, but also using herbal remedies learned through tradition or copied manuscripts.
But maybe not always the most effective remedies. The sources mention monks whispering incantations over crushed pearls, believing them to cure plague.
Exactly.
Really?
Or distilling alcohol not just for preservation, but as aqua vitae, the water of life, seen as a cure-all, a panacea. There was this strong belief that illness could be spiritual, demonic, or divine punishment. So the treatment had to involve prayer, relics, holy water, alongside the physical stuff.
Right. It wasn't just about fixing the body. It was about saving the soul or appealing to a higher power.
And the nuns especially were right there on the front lines, seeing immense suffering daily. The sources say they saw too many die whispering the names of saints. They provided comfort, care, a clean place perhaps, but often they were managing inevitable decline. Palliative care, in a sense.
And midwives. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous then.
Extremely dangerous. Childbed fever, postpartum infection was a huge killer. Midwives relied on practical experience passed down generations, but also heavily on ritual and superstition. Their hands slick with blood, reciting charms to ward off childbed fever, or tying red strings around the wrists of birthing mothers to ward off demons.
Trying to protect against forces they couldn't see or understand.
Precisely. It was a combination of hard-won practical skill, they knew how to handle births, and these layers of magical thinking aimed at controlling the uncontrollable, the invisible threats.
It makes you think about how knowledge even spread. You mentioned monks copying manuscripts.
Yeah, and that image of the novice monk copying by candlelight, the source notes, he does not know that half the remedies are useless.
Wow.
It perfectly captures the problem. Knowledge was preserved, yes, but often without critical assessment. Ineffective or even harmful practices got copied and passed down for centuries just because they were written down by an authority figure long ago. There was no systematic way to test if something actually worked.
Which leads us right into that whole shadow of superstition and ignorance you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
It feels like that was the real underlying condition.
I think that's a very fair assessment. The line between medicine and magic was incredibly blurry, almost non-existent sometimes. The belief in supernatural causes, God's will, demonic influence, bad stars, was pervasive because, well, what else could explain sudden illness or plagues?
If you don't know about bacteria or viruses.
You fill the gap with the supernatural, with the mystical. So people naturally clutched relics, prayed to saints, drank potions thick with ground-up saints' bones, anything to tip the scales toward survival. We saw it with the crushed pearls for plague, the charms for childbirth.
The powdered unicorn horn.
All of it. It wasn't just a few people believing this. It was culturally embedded, a desperate attempt to find some agency, some control in a world where death felt random and frequent.
It's that human need for explanation, isn't it? Even a magical one feels better than none. But okay, besides the magical, there was this other huge, unseen enemy. Infection.
Yes. The great unseen killer. And the tragic irony is that their own practices often made it worse. Infection lurked, creeping in like shadow beneath the door, as one source puts it. They just didn't understand transmission.
Because they couldn't see germs.
Exactly, no germ theory. So the connection between, say, the surgeon's unwashed hands, the reused rotted bandages, and the wound festering, it just wasn't made. That smell of vinegar and decay in the sick room, that was the smell of bacteria running rampant.
And the barber surgeons scraping away infection with a razor.
Futile. Probably introducing more bacteria from the blade itself. or from the water he rinsed it in. That image of the dog licking a puddle tinged with something darker than water, it just hints at the general lack of sanitation, how easily contaminants could spread unnoticed.
They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't comprehend, an enemy often carried on their own hands and tools.
Which brings us back to that powerful line from the sources. The real disease was ignorance, and it was contagious.
What does that mean exactly? Ignorance being contagious.
It means it wasn't just a passive lack of knowledge in individuals. It was a collective state, a cultural inability or unwillingness to question the status quo, the ancient authorities, the established practices. It spread like a contagion because questioning was rare and flawed ideas were repeated and accepted as truth.
So, observations that could have led somewhere, like the moldy bread, were just seen as weird flukes, miracles.
Probably not as something to investigate systematically. This intellectual inertia, this reliance on tradition over evidence, allowed ineffective and harmful practices to persist for centuries. The real terror wasn't just the pain, it was the not knowing. Why did this work? Why did that fail? Why did people keep dying?
So the patient didn't know the cure might kill them. The woman with the moldy bread didn't know why it helped. The monk copying the text didn't know it was useless.
Exactly. It was a dance with forces no one understood. Trying things out of sheer desperation, guided by flawed theories and superstition, not by reliable knowledge. And this pervasive ignorance directly impacted how society treated the sick, creating these really stark social dynamics.
Yeah, let's talk about that. The divide between rich and poor seems crucial here. Did money buy you better care? Or just more expensive, useless care?
Often the latter, sadly. There was definitely a difference in access. The wealthy could afford physicians, apothecaries, expensive ingredients. But as we've seen, that didn't necessarily mean effective treatment.
Right. Powdered emeralds and unicorn horns.
Exactly. The sources call it a cruel irony. The rich died draped in silk, their bodies stuffed with costly spices meant to preserve them. It's about status, comfort, maybe, but not cure. Meanwhile, the poor died with only a village wise woman's bitter tea.
So wealth bought you elaborate placebos, perhaps, more attention, but not necessarily a better outcome against serious disease.
Pretty much. It highlights a fundamental inequality. Sickness wasn't the great equalizer. It often just reinforced the existing social structure, even in how you died and were buried.
And beyond money, the disease itself could make you an outcast, couldn't it? The stigma.
Oh, absolutely. Fear of contagion was immense, even without understanding the mechanism. People with visible, frightening, or contagious diseases, think leprosy, plague, even severe skin conditions, were often shunned, treated like pariahs.
The sources say their bodies, mapped with rashes and swellings, became pariahs, their touch feared like a curse.
Yeah, that's incredibly isolating.
It is. You weren't just fighting the illness, you were fighting social death, too. Ostracized by your community, maybe even your family. Think about leper colonies or houses being boarded up during plague outbreaks.
And that image of the plague doctor with the beaked mask stuffed with herbs.
A terrifying image.
Yeah.
Meant to protect the doctor, sure, but it also created this huge visual and psychological barrier. It screamed, danger, unclean, keep away.
People literally turned their faces from the coughers, the limpers, the ones whose skin bore the marks of the king's evil. What was the king's evil again?
That was scrofula, a type of tuberculosis affecting the lymph nodes, causing neck swellings. And the belief was, bizarrely, that only the touch of the rightful monarch could cure it. Wow. Linking disease directly to royalty and divine right.
Yes. It shows how deeply illness was woven into the social and political fabric. Being sick wasn't just a medical issue. It was a social status, often a negative one. You became other.
But despite all this, the pain, the ignorance, the stigma, the fear, people still hoped, didn't they? They still sought treatment.
They did. And that's perhaps the most human part of this whole story. That stubborn flicker of hope, as one source calls it. Even facing terrible odds, people wanted to live. They wanted relief.
And that hope is why they subjected themselves to these brutal treatments.
I think so. It's why they'd endure the bloodletting, the purging, the cauterizing iron. Why they'd drink vile potions or pray fervently. Any chance, however slim, felt worth taking. The sources say the real horror was not the blade or the burn. It was the hope that flickered, stubborn in the dark.
That's powerful. Hope as horror. Because it kept you going through the suffering, maybe even prolonged it.
Possibly. Or maybe it just made the inevitable end even harder to bear when it came. But that hope, tied to faith, tied to just the basic human survival instinct, it was incredibly resilient. It's what drove people to keep trying, keep seeking help, even in a system so fraught with danger and uncertainty. It speaks volumes about the human spirit, really.
Which brings us, I suppose, to that inevitable end, because death was just everywhere, wasn't it? Not like today, where it's often hidden away.
Absolutely omnipresent. It was a constant, familiar reality. High mortality rates, especially for infants and children, but really across the board. For many illnesses, death wasn't a possible outcome. It was the expected outcome.
The sources say sometimes the only medicine was time, meaning time until you died.
Essentially, yes. Or time to see if your body could somehow fight it off on its own, which often it couldn't. It led to this deep-seated fatalism, an acceptance that's hard for us to truly connect with. The Reaper was the only physician who never failed.
That's grim. It probably felt true.
It reflected their daily reality, hearing the church bell tolling frequently, another soul gone, seeing the gravedigger constantly at work, his shovel biting into fresh earth. These weren't shocking events, they were the rhythm of life and death.
The backdrop to everything, like that image of the rain washing the streets where the dead outnumber the living during a plague, it's atmospheric.
It is. Or consider someone with consumption tuberculosis, that slow wasting away. The sources state it plainly. There will be no cure, only the slow, inexorable fade. Everyone knew it. The patient, the family, the physician. There might be attempts to ease symptoms, prayers offered, but the end was foreseen.
And this constant presence of death, it must have affected the living profoundly, that turning away from the sick.
It wasn't just fear of catching something. It was likely also a defense mechanism, a way to cope with the overwhelming presence of suffering and mortality, a constant reminder of one's own fragility. Seeing neighbors, friends, family succumb. It takes a toll.
Yeah. You can almost picture the individual moments. The widow lighting a candle, the family watching helplessly. Each death part of this huge collective struggle against forces they just didn't understand and couldn't control.
It really underscores the profound limits of their knowledge against the harsh biological realities. Life itself was a battle, and for so many, so often, death was the victor. It was just the way things were.
So wrapping this up, it's been quite a journey into a pretty dark place. We've seen a world where trying to heal was this terrifying gamble, often more dangerous than the illness itself. A world ruled by superstition, by desperation, and just a fundamental lack of understanding about how bodies and diseases work.
It definitely throws our modern medical knowledge into sharp relief, doesn't it? It makes you appreciate things like anesthesia and antibiotics on a whole new level.
Oh, sure.
But it also shows that universal human drive, the need to ease suffering, to find answers, to hope even when the tools and the knowledge were so tragically limited. The terror wasn't just the physical pain, was it? It was that awful uncertainty, the not knowing.
Yeah, the not knowing seems key, which does make you wonder. Looking back from their perspective, our medicine seems miraculous. But what about looking forward from ours? What things that we accept as normal, as fact, as effective treatment now? What might future generations look back on and just shake their heads?
That's a fascinating and slightly uncomfortable question, isn't it? In our own age, supposedly overflowing with information, where do we still place our faith without full understanding? What are the ignorances, the collective blind spots that might still be contagious today, shaping how we think about health, illness, and even life itself, maybe in ways we can't yet see?
Something to definitely think about. It puts our own time in a different light.